This was a map of the British Isles around 860. A couple of decades later, it looked like this. The new area was known as the Danelaw, and it was brought about by a giant invasion of Vikings, known today as the Great Heathen Army. The coalition of Viking warlords would together overrun the Kingdom of Northumbria before invading the Kingdom of Mercia next. Finally, the Danes attempted to raid and perhaps even occupy Wessex, but here Alfred, King of Wessex, would secure a victory over the invaders, in the process solidifying his control over the remaining Anglo-Saxon territories. In the peace, King Guthrum of East Anglia, one of the invading warlords, would be baptized into the Catholic Church, while the division between Anglo-Saxon and Danelaw would be established. But we need to be clear here. The Danelaw is a term invented centuries later by the English. The idea of a unified entity, like I portray here, did not exist. In the north was the city of Jorvik, centered around the modern-day city of York, while in the south was the Kingdom of East Anglia, previously mentioned. Between them lay a whole host of smaller warlords. The idea of a true, unified Danelaw is simply wrong. It was a collection of warlords in territory recognized as being theirs, at least for now, by the King of Wessex. And for what it was, it didn't last long. King Edward, son of Alfred, would launch a successful reconquest of most of the southeast, and a couple of decades later, the north too would be invaded, as Wessex officially formed the Kingdom of England, uniting the previously divided crowns of the region. So, for this scenario, we will basically be asking, what if the Wessexian conquest of the Danelaw had failed and this division had actually lasted? Now in my mind, the easiest way to accomplish this would be to have an even greater success in the initial invasion, conquering or at least subjugating Mercia and Wessex. The issue with this though is that the scenario then switches to what if England was conquered by Vikings rather than what if the Danelaw survived, leading to England being split. So we will still have things happen in roughly the same way, but we will just assume that reconquest attempts by Wessex fail in the short term. With the randomness of medieval alternate histories, this can happen in a number of ways. Instability can weaken the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, we can have the Danes unite better against them, or the Danes can simply get lucky in combat. Whatever the reason, for now, the split remains. One major issue now is centralization. There is only so long that we can handwave the Danish realms not getting conquered by Wessex, which would unite Mercia and Wessex into the most powerful kingdom on the Isle. We could see moderate amounts of expansion of the major kingdoms, which would make it easier, but to really compete with Wessex, we need to find a way to more permanently unite the Danelaw. Now I think the easiest way to achieve this would be via a figure like Knut the Great, who in our timeline would rule over England, Denmark and Norway. While Knut himself is probably butterflied from this timeline, the idea of a warlord from Norway or Denmark coming in to conquer the divided lands of the Danelaw and continuing into Wessex too is not a crazy one. Now keep in mind that by this point, the Danelaw would have already been in place for centuries, so the exact borders are very difficult to predict. Anyways, from this point, the new ruler could formalize the split between Viking England and Anglo-Saxon England. And much like in our timeline, such an overseas union is unlikely to be long-lasting, and as it collapses, we have finally achieved our goal. An England split between two separate kingdoms, which we will dub the Kingdom of Wessex and the Kingdom of Jorvik. Remember, the term Danelaw was a later invention, and it was not something that they would actually call themselves. Now by this point, we've had more than a century of Danelaw rule, and it would start to affect the people of the region. While the Vikings, by this point, have embraced Christianity, the people of the region are very slowly diverging from the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex. Across its existence, Norse and Danes migrate to the region, building towns and farming the land. At no point do these groups ever overtake the Anglo-Saxons in terms of population, but differences, even if subtle, develop between the regions. Languages diverge, customs diverge, the governing structures and nobles of the two realms diverge. After 150 years, The differences are by no means massive, but they are noticeable and growing. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. So with this split achieved, we must acknowledge that going further into detail for this alternate history is very difficult. The issue with medieval alternate histories is that the slightest difference in who marries who can radically reshape entire kingdoms. This effect goes further than just within the British Isles. French King Louis IV was the son of a Wessex princess, and King Otto I of Germany married a Wessexian princess as well. But when these marriages took place in our timeline, Wessex had united England. This alternate Wessex would find securing such high-profile marriages far more difficult. This leads to massive butterfly effects, where after about 100 years of history, most of the important families in history could be irreversibly changed. This means we cannot go into as much detail as I'd like to for normal alternate history videos, as everything is different in minor or very major ways. But just because we have to be broad doesn't mean that we can't still predict a number of things. Initially, I would expect relations between the two kingdoms to be similar to that of England and Scotland in our timeline. The border is very susceptible to raids from both sides, and it could be very movable depending on which of the two kingdoms was stronger at any given moment of time. It is even possible that they could conquer each other every now and again. Obviously, either could permanently disappear at any point. That's the nature of such alternate histories, but if we have learned anything from Scotland, this is not guaranteed after just one defeat. There were many times in history where the far stronger England temporarily captured Scotland, only for the nobles to throw them out again. Such a dynamic might also occur here, preventing either from fully dominating the other. But there is a big difference. Between England and Scotland, Scotland was the clear underdog. By the year 1000, England had more than 3 times the Scottish population. This dynamic is totally different between Jorvik and Wessex, as the two kingdoms might actually be roughly equal to one another. And this constant competition between roughly equal states gives a lot of opportunity to 3 historical underdogs in this region. Let's start with Scotland. One actor we haven't discussed yet are the Norse territories around Scotland and in Ireland. These would likely grow close to the Kingdom of Jorvik. This is quite interesting as they surround Scotland. We could see a rather interesting dynamic form here, where Scotland could actually ally themselves to the Anglo-Saxon Wessex against the Danes. Over centuries, this could actually lead to a larger Scotland being a far more important player in British geopolitics and having to spend far less time and effort defending their own independence. Now, the second region that could benefit is Ireland. Their population during this time was actually rather close to England. Should the Emerald Isle unite, they could make themselves a formidable force in the area. Yet, sadly, I don't see any reason for this to happen in this timeline. Ireland, during this period, had a strong clan-based, decentralized nature. Their system relied a lot on elective leadership, and while on paper there was usually a High King of Ireland, who, on paper, ruled over the other clans, in practice they never really created lasting unity. In my mind, there are 2 options for Ireland. At least in the short term, they would just isolate themselves from politics on the British Isle, caught in their own disputes, remaining on the periphery of Europe. Alternatively though, the island could be opened up and divided between the British nations, starting a devastating spiral of independence fighting and infighting supported by outside powers. I'm very sorry, Ireland. I'll make a What If Ireland United at some point. Then finally, we have Wales. Where Wessex and Scotland likely ally against Jorvik, Wales is likewise likely to loosely align themselves with Jorvik. Now, unlike Ireland, Wales did actually have significant centralization, mainly between Gwynedd and the Heubarth. Now in our timeline, despite the massive overweight that England had, it took them 300 years to decisively conquer Wales. With the backing of Jorvik, this could be prevented, possibly giving us 2 main Welsh states, or eventually even a united independent Wales. Now, with the British Isles discussed, let's discuss some effects on the rest of Europe. For much of early medieval history, the British Isles were relatively peripheral. Not necessarily unimportant, but compared to the continent, with Charlemagne and his successor states, it was difficult for England to compete initially. Of course, population isn't everything, but England had a population of about 1.4 million, France 7.2, and Germany 5.9, though the combined HRE had 12. Compared to the behemoths of the era, England simply couldn't yet compare. This changed with this man, William the Conqueror. He would launch an invasion from his holdings in Normandy, conquering England. This had one very important side effect: it would interlink England for the next 500 years with the Kingdom of France. This would lead to a strange dynamic for centuries. On paper, both were kingdoms, and thus they should be equals. But also, England held territories that were part of the Kingdom of France, leaving the King of England technically a vassal of the French king. Furthermore, France is looking very powerful here, but the king actually only controlled a very limited amount of territory within the nation. With their power base across the Channel, the kings of England would actually manage to dominate the French at various points in history, even almost uniting the two crowns. These Anglo-French conflicts would form the foundation of both France and England, and its being gone will have incalculable effects on the rest of Europe. Now, it is still absolutely possible that a Norman-type invasion of Wessex still occur, potentially even uniting the kingdoms, at least temporarily. But assuming that only Wessex falls, the effects that this has on France are completely different. The Norman kings are still powerful, but they cannot just pull the resources from England to fight the King of France with. In fact, I would argue that this alternate Norman England, should it come to be, is forced to be a loyal ally of the French king. Why? Because let's imagine that the Norman king has some independent aspirations to compete with the King of France. What is the first thing that the King of France does? That's right, ally themselves with the Kingdom of Jorvik, which could very swiftly end disastrously for the Normans. So, should an invasion have occurred, the dynamic is once again shifted. Where we already had Anglo-Saxon Danish culture on the northeast against the Anglo-Saxons in Wessex, the differences grow yet stronger, as the Normans now bring French elements over to the southwest. The two areas, once more, grow yet further and further apart. Though, of course, it is also very possible that such a Norman invasion never occurs in the first place. Now, the lack of a Norman England, or at worst, a much weaker version, likely to be friendly to Paris, I can see two broad paths for France to go in the future. On the one hand, competition with England allowed the French kings to gradually centralize control over France. This allowed France to become uniquely well centralized, as opposed to their rivals in the HRE or Spain. This increasing centralization gave France a huge edge in the early modern era, and as the centuries progressed, many states would model their nation after the French. The question of French centralization is thus crucial in this alternate history. It is not unthinkable that, without a clear rival the French nobles have to unite against, French centralization never happens, or at least happens way slower. This would lead to a far more stagnant Europe, Britain locked into internal competition, and do I even need to mention the HRE? Minor conflict would absolutely still occur, but with both of the most powerful Christian states decentralized and incapable of expansion, Western Europe would end up looking completely different, becoming a far more decentralized and stagnant region, at least until something like the discovery of America would completely shake up the region. Now, alternatively, it is possible that France still centralizes in a similar timeline. Over centuries, the French kings, if they are lucky and skilled, could steadily increase their direct and indirect control over the nation until eventually a critical mass is reached and some form of real unity is created. The amount of energy expended in the Franco-English wars is insane, and with France not having to deal with them, they might focus their energy in the late Middle Ages elsewhere. Perhaps they expand into Iberia, perhaps they manage to conquer Flanders, maybe they turn the tables and make parts of England part of their kingdom. Perhaps they even spend more time and effort into the Crusades. None of these possibilities are guaranteed, but in our timeline, France had around 20% of Europe's population. Adding to that, the millions that died in wars to England, which wouldn't now, as well as the lack of England as a major rival, such a France could quickly become hegemonic over Western Europe. So roughly, that is what I would expect to happen had the Danelaw survived and turned into an actual kingdom. I know this was vaguer than my videos normally are, but that's just what happens with medieval alternate histories. Let me know if you enjoyed it and if you want to see more of these. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.